My brothers and sisters in Christ, today's gospel passage illustrates very clearly why it is so important that a regular examination of conscience be a staple in our spiritual lives. At the highest level, we think of the discipline of going to the sacrament of penance or going to confession. And this, of course, is critically important. However, strictly speaking, the sacrament of penance itself is only completely necessary for the forgiveness of mortal sins. Venial sins are forgiven through other means, including our attendance at the Eucharist itself. And so, while it is a good spiritual discipline to go have a regular kind of schedule or habit of going to confession, it's not strictly necessary for these other kinds of sins. However, whether or not, regardless of how frequent your confession schedule is, just out of discipline, and you have different people with different schools of thought, I'd typically say you should go at least once a month. Every 2 weeks is good. Some recommend weekly. Sometimes I think weekly becomes a little too rote. Having weeks, days of the week where you go versus not go sometimes can be helpful, but different people have different schools of thought. Certainly, if you're aware of grave sin, go to confession whenever. But beyond just going to confession itself, we have other means of doing examination of conscience. That is, we can, even just as part of daily prayer, find a time each day to sit down and examine the day. Where did I respond to God's call well? Where did I fail to step up? Where did I either do wrong or fail to do the good I was called to do? And we can offer these to the Lord in prayer. Again, not, we need confession for grave sins, but for the rest, there is importance in having it at the forefront. When we don't live a life of constant examination of conscience, we begin to grow conceited. It's very easy to constantly see the faults of others, but forget just how much we're guilty of our own things here and there that may drive others crazy and certainly offend the Lord, but we give hardly any thought to it. And this is illustrated very clearly in today's gospel, in this parable that Jesus offers, where the servant is forgiven, as the passage says, just it's translated as a huge debt. The actual number in it is inconceivable. This person's debt is something that you couldn't pay back in 100 lifetimes if you were this servant. And yet the master forgives this debt and then turns around and begins to treat horribly his brother servant for a tiny amount in comparison. And so this contrast shows that the master calls the servant back, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all this. Shouldn't you have had compassion on your brother?" Well, when we're not mindful of our own debt, then we begin to grow more judgmental of others. I've talked before, even my own experience sometimes, as someone who hears confessions every day, that typically my experience is not to be judgmental of people's sins themselves, and I'm generally not. If I hear something and I begin to react with annoyance with someone's weakness, I almost always have a check of, wow, where did that come from? And almost always when I examine, it'll be, you missed your own examination of conscience, or you're overdue for confession yourself. What happens when I'm not in touch with how much I'm dependent on the mercy of God? Then my own immediate sense of mercy to others is diminished. And so this is why it's important, not out of a sense of good old Catholic guilt, to constantly remind ourselves of how much we're a sinner, but to have appreciation for the goodness of God, to have awe for the mercy that's been shown for us. And when we're reminded of how undeserving we are and yet what a great gift we've received, how can we not be more merciful to one another and not go on to forgive the other 70 times 7 times? As Peter and Jesus are discussing. And so, if it's not already a staple in your life, first of all, make a habit of going to confession. But second of all, find a way to work in a daily examination of conscience. Formally, informally, however, but a time to sit down and review. This will pay dividends in the spiritual life, not only for growing in virtue and uprooting vice out of our lives, but growing in gratitude and therefore our ability to extend mercy to others. May God bless you all.